Initializing Enduring Play Podcast Season 1 engine. Decompressing audio. Synchronizing waveforms. Reticulating splines. Launching podcast lobby.
Welcome back to Enduring Play, the podcast where we explore what it takes to create video games that don't just survive, but thrive. I'm your host, Cheryl Platts, video game designer, director, and author of the Game Development Strategy Guide, a new book from Rosenfeld Media. In this first season of the podcast, we bring the full context of some of the interviews that informed that book to life. Today's guest, Amy Kalson, is a trained game designer who has taken that experience all the way to senior leadership. Her roles range from game designer to producer to chief product officer and now executive design producer at Meta. Today's podcast levels cover everything from basic production advice and gaming labor law to advanced game design topics like playtest iteration, creative collaboration, adapting to global cultural differences, video game leadership strategy, and the interpretation of existing intellectual property for games. But first, one of the world's weirdest client meetings. Let's get into the game.
Player 1, Cheryl Platts. Player 2, Amy Kalson. Podcast level, start.
I'm so excited and delighted to be talking to a dear friend who is a very talented video game developer, game designer, producer, writer with a wide variety of experience, Amy Kalson. Amy, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Cheryl. It is a pleasure and joy to talk to you about this stuff. We've known each other for a long time. We've had lots of conversations along these lines, and I think it's just great that you're bringing this knowledge to the world. I'm Amy Kalson. I've been making games for over 20 years, a very long time now. I started originally as a producer, and then I spent the bulk of my career as a game designer. And in my later years have transferred back into production and team management as well. So that's me in a nutshell. I've worked for companies like Disney, EA, on every platform you can imagine, on console, on mobile. I just shipped a PC game, and my future belongs to VR. I'm pretty much covering all the bases.
I love it. No stone left unturned. I have Amy to thank, along with a couple of other people, for helping me get my first job in games at Maxis, now owned by Electronic Arts, where we both worked on Sims games and had very strong opinions about motive failures and which beds to buy. And we lived through the very heady days of The Sims 2 and all those console titles. And then we got to work together again when you came over to Griptonite Games to work with me on Disney Friends DS.
Loading. Podcast level 1. Milestone review.
When we were getting ready for this discussion, you pointed out that we have a pretty epic story from our time working together on Disney Friends. And maybe that's a fun way to start because, there's a lot of business we'll cover, but sometimes reality is stranger than fiction. We have a business meeting with Disney at Griptonite Games, a major summit with our Disney counterparts to review the game design for Disney Friends. Disney Friends was the largest contract we'd ever done at Griptonite Games. It was really, really important that we get it right. We loved our contacts over there, Stephen and Sunoco, if you're listening. And so we're having them out for a 2-day summit to go through everything, make sure we're aligned, and the studio was taking it super seriously. As a side note, there was a Narnia conference room that was created a couple years prior to get our first Disney contract. And yes, you literally had to go through a wardrobe to get into that conference room. But we weren't in the Narnia conference room. We were in a normal conference room.
I remember it was like a really serious meeting, which is funny because we had such a good relationship with Disney at the time, but it was like really intense. Like you and I had prepared a lot for it. And like the four of us, the Stephen and Sunoco from Disney and the two of us were like intensely engaged, like going like super in depth and like design details at this moment in time. And like, it was like one of those meetings where you're just in the zone and you're completely focused.
And of course, we get in that day, and as luck would have it, the air conditioning is not working. So there's this just like general work going on around the office and like a couple offices down from the conference room we're in. But, it's fine. We'll focus. It's fine.
And then
things had been escalating outside the conference room because the air conditioning construction had moved adjacent to the conference room, and we've been hearing these like buzzing and thumping But still, we're trying to focus. So this keeps building over the course of the day while we're trying to do our very serious business meeting.
Heard this noise that was like this zapping noise.
Then we're getting to a pretty tense point in the meeting.
Then there's the mother of all zaps, and we hear this guy say, I'm not going to swear, but he says, "Oh shoot," but the swear version of that, and falls through the ceiling.
Half of him falls through the ceiling panels. His lower half, his upper half is still up there, and it would have been easier to deal with if there had been a whole man that just had fallen on to the table, but instead we had half a man just dangling. The table, which had been strewn with game design documents, was now strewn with ceiling tiles, and there's just this dead silence for a second. Silence required to process what has just happened. And eventually one of us figures out, I don't know who, but figures out how to ask, "Are you okay?"
And he says, punchline, "Don't worry, this happens all the time," which I will never forget. The best line ever.
A line delivered by a man hanging halfway out of the ceiling after being electrocuted by the HVAC system in our video game studio while we were trying to convince Disney that we were worth paying.
No pitch meeting after that was ever that stressful, because at least there wasn't someone literally falling through the ceiling onto the table.
Oh, that's right. I think we tried to keep going.
But for a little bit, he brought the shop vac in
and started vacuuming, and that's when we stopped.
We were done. But you know what? They greenlit it. We got everything we wanted.
If we could survive electrocution, we could probably ship your game. Part of our stress is with this huge contract, but we were a fairly indie studio, and we wanted to project that we were totally up to this insane amount of money. And then the ceiling's falling. And they said, "Are we not paying you enough?"
What's funny is that was such a nice normal office building, but like weird things were constantly happening. Like the day the bathroom caught on fire, of all things to catch on fire, like a bathroom? Really?
Oh yeah, Griptonite. Those were good times at Griptonite.
Podcast level paused. Begin host commentary.
If you've ever watched the Apple TV series Mythic Quest, you might have thought that it was an over-dramatization of video game development. But I'm here to tell you that sometimes video game development is just as ridiculous as it seems on TV.
Loading. Podcast level 2. Career advice.
What's one thing that you wish you knew when starting out in the video game industry, aside from the risk of electrocution?
This was such a good question and such a hard question, because I think there are a million things I wish I knew, and picking one is really hard. But I think for me, the most important thing, like if I could go back in time and talk to young me who was really excited to get into the industry, the one thing I would say is understand where people are coming from, especially when you think they're not being very kind. I think it took me a long time to develop the wisdom to really pay attention, not just to what people are doing, but to why they're doing them. And I think when I started to understand that, a lot of things got a lot easier for me, work-wise and personally. I think it's a good lesson in general. But that's the one piece of wisdom I would give myself.
It's such great advice that I'm pretty sure you gave me at some point, because that perspective has served me so well over the years since I've known you. Why are they doing the thing?
Yeah.
And in a way, game designers are very well equipped to do this because they're experts in human behavior, trying to understand why people do things and what would make people do things. Really interesting, because some other folks I've talked to also choose to lead not with technical advice, like the secret to making the best possible game design, but they say it's about the people.
Yeah.
And that speaks to how complex and interconnected game development is.
Yeah, I think that's really right. I think early on in my career, I thought that making a great game was enough, that was the goal. We were here, we were going to make great products that were going to make lots of people happy, and we'd have lots of players, and that was how you won. Now that I'm older, I really think about it differently. Making great games is not enough. I think it's great to make great products and to put them out there and to make players happy, but I also want to work on great teams. I also want to help people. I want to help people make their dreams come true as well. and that making great products at all costs is not worth it. You know, if you're doing it at the expense of others, then you're doing it wrong.
Totally agree. And that was something we both took really seriously on Disney Friends. You and I both came from Electronic Arts, both worked there during the so-called EA spouse era. And, you know, that really influenced our perspective on how important it was to make games without burning people out.
Loading tutorial module. EA spouse. Video game industry labor rights. Deconstructing crunch.
On November 11th, 2004, a then anonymous poster by the pseudonym EA Spouse posted to LiveJournal, a popular microblogging site from the early aughts, where much of the video game industry lurked at the time.
Excerpt from EA spouse post.
My significant other works for Electronic Arts, and I'm what you might call a disgruntled spouse. EA's bright and shiny new corporate trademark is challenge everything. To any EA executive that happens to read this, I have a good challenge for you. How about safe and sane labor practices for the people on whose backs you walk for your millions? The current mandatory hours are 9 a.m. to 10 p.m., 7 days a week, with the occasional Saturday evening off for good behavior. At 6:30 p.m., this averages out to an 85-hour work week. And the kicker, for the honor of this treatment, EA salaried employees receive A, no overtime, B, no compensation time, C, no additional sick or vacation leave.
This post lit the industry up like a powder keg, catalyzing 3 class action lawsuits against Electronic Arts that led to permanent changes, like the reclassification of some entry-level employees as hourly. The post's author was later revealed to be Erin Hoffman, herself a video game developer. Her husband, Leander Hasty, was a member of the development team for Lord of the Rings: The Battle for Middle-earth. This team shared the second floor of the EA Redwood Shores campus with many of us working on The Sims. When the post came out, I saw our own work practices reflected in Erin's complaints. I have 80-hour-a-week pay stubs from my intern time to verify Erin's claims. Folks like Amy and myself watched ourselves and our peers burning out and felt we could do better. Erin's advocacy permanently moved the conversation about video game crunch to center stage and started a decades-long reduction in crunch time reports across the industry that has only recently begun to show signs of a slight erosion of gains based on reports from the International Game Developers Association, or IGDA, and their regular quality of life reports. In 2004, they found that 97.6% of respondents said their role expects crunch time. By 2019, that number was down to 42%. But in 2023, it was back up to 44%. But there were irregularities in 2023 data. More people report required crunch time than reported experiencing it. And an additional 25% of respondents reported non-crunch extended working hours. This might mean overwork is increasing again under a different name. Regardless, one of the best ways to prevent crunch is good planning.
Loading. Podcast level 3. Planning and production.
You know, I feel like the industry really sort of knew, but nobody wanted to admit this was happening at scale until the EA spouse posts went live. Well, this is the early aughts, right? So you could do things on LiveJournal and have it drop like journalism. And it did. It was this big deal. And then another follow-up post came and talked about our team specifically, which was super fun. But we don't need to unpack all that.
Yeah.
But that explains how you and I ended up at a smaller game studio not terribly long after that, really motivated to create a game development team where we could make a good game and not burn people out. And I remember we were very intentional about every milestone, making sure we had built time into the schedule for nothing, for bug fixes, and for the inevitable changes our client would ask us to make because they are Disney and they have high standards.
Right. And I think if I remember correctly, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you used 25% of time.
I did.
And I think that was really wise and worked really well for us on that project in particular.
This was in the olden days when we used the waterfall method of planning where tasks would cascade off of each other as opposed to agile where you pull them all out of the bucket. But let's be real. Even when you do agile these days, there's still something a little waterfall about it.
Unless you work for one of these developers, and there are a handful like Valve that have really deep pockets and can afford to really take all the time they need to make something truly special, then you have to kind of work in a waterfall way, because eventually you're going to run out of money, you're going to run out of time, your publisher's going to get annoyed. You can't just iterate forever. You have a deadline. So, I think Agile is great. I actually really believe in a lot of the Agile principles and methodology, but I've never seen it work in a very pure way in video games. I think it always has to be adapted to fit a greater framework, which is usually a little bit of waterfall because dates are usually fairly hard and inflexible.
Agile starts to make more sense for me when a game has released and it's moving from a production mindset into an operational mindset. And you don't always know how much time you're going to have or how many bugs you're going to have, what's going to happen in real time. So having that big backlog of items ready to go makes much more sense. But when you have no game and you want to get to game, it usually makes sense to put the fairly known set of things you need to complete to get to game on a calendar so that they get done in the right order. I know you and I were very proud of how we managed to respect people's time, and I still get people coming to me and telling me that was one of the best game development experiences they ever had. Now, that is not to say we didn't have our share of challenges like surgeries and babies and car accidents, but we still made it work.
But somehow it all worked and we made it anyway. Recently I was interviewing for what will be my next role, which is my dream job. And they asked me, out of all the games you've made, I made 40 something games I think I've shipped in my career. They said, out of all those games, what project are you most proud of? And I didn't even have to think. I immediately said Disney Friends, because I think what we did, we were doing things that, even Nintendo said wasn't possible. And somehow our team was making that happen. We had a wonderful partner in our partners at Disney who let us really make what we wanted to make, that we were passionate about. And I think, even though a lot of us, we were fairly young in our careers, we didn't have a lot of experience back then, but we made up for it by being very clever and working really well together as a team and really trusting each other in a way that is unfortunately, I think, somewhat unusual in games, and I think the teams that learn how to do that really do great things.
Loading. Podcast Level 4. Innovation, iteration, and playtesting.
We were developing for early Nintendo DS, and we had 3D on 2 screens, not just one. That was the kind of clever the team had. We were also so curious. We did so much testing, and we learned so much about the game. And we made some major changes as a result of what we got. One of the stories I always tell in my interviews is about the play tests we ran, with the original Stitch level, and Stitch is like catnip for kids, right? Especially boys. And we tested with the range of boys and girls, and the girls loved the game because we had designed it to be immersive, 3D on 2 screens. It's about the relationship. We got rid of all the UI, but the boys came out of that test and were like, I don't know what to do. And I had this panic moment as lead producer. I'm like, oh my God, we messed up. How do you ruin Stitch? How do you make boys not like playing with Stitch? And you and I were talking through this, but then we realized the way that it was phrased in the feedback, I don't know what to do, spoke to mastery. And so in the book, I talk about that example. And it doesn't have to be boys, right? It's just a very gendered reflection of how kids are raised. But mastery is a very real motivator for a lot of people to play games. And by removing all the UI, we had spoken to people who wanted companionship, but there was no goal, nothing to master. So do you remember what we did to fix that?
Was that when we added pin collecting to the game?
No, we added friendship points. Those gold sparkles that showed up when you did something nice for the characters, which was a mechanic we already had in the game. You could already do nice things for the characters. We just weren't telling you how much good to do to the characters per day. We had assumed that would be intrinsic. But by adding a single UI element to the upper right of the screen to give you a daily goal of goodness to do to the characters, it gave something to master. We put it back in front of the kids, and the boys were like, I love this game. I'm going to play it all the time. Because they could suddenly master being friends with Stitch. And the girls loved it because we hadn't changed the core companionship mechanic, and we hadn't changed that we allowed both. I loved that the resolution allowed both of those playstyles to exist.
Yeah, and was that the playtest where one of the girls was so excited that she wouldn't excuse herself to use the bathroom?
Yes. Yeah, that Speaking of other things that happen in game development, we definitely had to take a chair out of rotation in one of the playtests, which is a good problem to have.
If you can make a game that is so immersive and engaging that somebody does not want to get up to use the restroom and would rather just go right there, you've made something probably pretty special. But also maybe you should remind people to take breaks.
Speaking of immersion, in those same tests, it was like an alpha build. And when the game broke, it would go to a black screen that said like assert file.cpp and a bunch of binary on it. And another thing that really stuck out to me was kids were explaining that Stitch had chosen to do that to them because of actions they had taken. And I was like, wow, boy, we are immersive. If they are explaining the game is crashing because Stitch chose to do it because you didn't give him a sandwich fast enough, then you could not recover that crash without a human.
I mean, I think that's the magic of making things for kids is everything is so much realer for kids than it is for grown-ups. Their kids are much more able and willing to like suspend their disbelief and go into whatever experience you've made. But also you need to be careful because they will do exactly that. So I think just watching kids' reaction to that game was incredible. And you and I will occasionally stumble across a YouTube video of somebody like replaying it now, which I think is pretty amazing all these years later for a small title.
Podcast Level 5. Adapting designs for emotional impact and age groups.
You mentioned that you've worked on over 40 games, and you also mentioned how kids play games versus adults. What are the differences you've noticed when you approach game design for games that are more for a younger market versus a more adult market? Because you've done the full spectrum.
Yeah, I have done the spectrum. That's a great question. I think in many ways it is similar. Not the same, but similar. I think where it really differs is that kids are much more likely to try things out. They're likely to get more immersed into things. They are less afraid of breaking things than adults usually are. I think adults are very self-conscious in a way that a lot of kids aren't when they approach a new experience or new piece of software. And I think, there's almost a adaptability with kids that don't exist for adults, which doesn't mean that you want to make your software any less good or less finished or less complete for kids. But I think that there's a certain willingness to engage technology on a very basic level that adults lose over the years. I don't know why they lose it, but I think, there's sort of a degree of self-consciousness that comes into play and awareness of how you're interfacing with technology that kids don't have. You see that in VR now. Kids will just pick up a VR helmet and jump right in and start hitting buttons until they figure out what's happening. Adults are very much more hesitant and much more afraid to kind of dive in on that level.
I wonder how much of that is related to how much as adults we have awareness of cost benefit and risk reward, especially if you own the device or have been burned by software before.
For sure. I think that's part of it. And I also just think that there's a desire in grownups to not look foolish in front of other people that certainly exists in kids to some degree, but it's a little different. And I think the parameters of what makes you feel foolish are different when you're a kid than when you're an adult.
Mention of feeling foolish reminds me of one of my favorite stories from our mutual time working on Disney Friends DS. When I was standing outside our lead programmer's office, he was testing the voice controls. You could press a button to speak to one of the characters called Push to Talk, there are very few games doing voice control on the Nintendo DS. We were very innovative at the time, but he had to test whether or not you could accurately speak to Stitch, whether Stitch would listen to him. And it was going to use this grammar-based, dictionary-based voice control. So he leans in, presses a button, and he doesn't know I'm watching. But even so, as quietly as possible, he's like,
I love you, Stitch.
And nothing happens. Because this is old school, very primary voice recognition tech, and it's not loud enough. So he presses it again. And, he says,
I love you, Stitch.
But again, no dice. Pretty basic. It's mostly assuming a child's going to yell at it. And so, exasperated human, he presses it one more time.
I love you, Stitch.
And he's yelling at it. But I'm just sitting there like, I am getting a master class in human behavior. Because why would an adult male who is being paid to make this game be embarrassed to say that to the device as a testing scenario, even if he doesn't know anyone's watching? That was so instructive for me about the power of voice recognition and how it hits people differently, emotionally.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that these certain things are so loaded psychologically.
In response to seeing that, we actually added a synonym for the I love you command. We added the word friend. So the people who were embarrassed by saying I love you did not have to do it and feel that embarrassment.
That even when you are saying it to a cartoon character that's obviously, digital, it wasn't even a networked game. So you were sort of in your privacy of single player. It carries real weight and real psychological impact. And I think as designers, we need to always keep that in mind and always be aware of what we're asking people to do and issues people may have with what we're asking them to do. And I love that we came up with a workaround. And I wish that this was back in the days of data gathering, because I'd love to know how many people used the workaround.
Loading. Podcast level 6. Variety in video game production roles.
So one thing about your career, Amy, is you've worked with a variety of different titles. You mentioned you've been a game designer, you've been a producer. The producer role is notorious for being hard to pin down, but both of those roles are kind of elusive to a lot of people. And you bring this very unique perspective on what makes all of those roles what they are. Can you talk about how each of those roles have sort of manifested for you?
Sure, of course. So I think what's interesting about being a producer is that I think it's a little different at every studio. A lot of the jobs are similar, a lot of the roles overlap, but each place has been just a slightly different flavor of what they expect from producers. I've worked at companies where producers are kind of designers. I think we had a lot of that early on at Maxis, where you had to come up through production in order to eventually become a game designer, which drove me crazy at the time, by the way. I hated that. But in hindsight, I'm so grateful for that because it gave me a grounding in production that I could then use later on. At the time, I just wanted to design and was mad that I had to learn spreadsheets and Excel, but now I love it. So I think, part of the mystique around the production role is that it's kind of a catch-all in some ways. You're responsible for, certainly for the project management aspects of the job, things like planning. Some places you're responsible for the financial aspects of the job, things like budgeting. Staffing, hiring. I've done a ton of hiring and staffing up for teams, things that I never thought I'd do because I do not have a background in HR. It really encompasses so much. And I think that now we're seeing hybrid roles between design and production. You've got like the game director role, which is fairly new, and a title that I've had in the past as well, which really is like your creative director, but you're also sort of the executive producer kind of meshed into one. On the team, and it just can vary wildly, from place to place. But I think for me, the thing that really, at least for me, defines production is that you're really there to remove roadblocks for people on your team. You're there to help people do their best work. And anything you can do personally and professionally to eliminate the obstacles that people have to making a great thing, it's on you to do that. I learned a lot about production working with you as my producer on Disney Friends. Certainly you were an absolute master of like planning and budgeting. And, I think that extra buffer you put in was magical for us and let us do a lot of things on the team that we wouldn't have time to do or put in the game otherwise. And also the way that you handled challenges that would come up both on the corporate side and with Disney, I thought was really informative, and you did just an incredible job with that. And so I've tried to take those things that I learned and carry them forward into my jobs, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so, but that's always the goal.
Thank you for the kind words. And we had such a remarkable team on that project. I will admit that when I left, because after Disney Friends, I took a break from video games and did my little walkabout, worked on a bunch of other things for like a decade, and was glad to not have a ringing producer phone for a while, when phones were still a thing. But I don't know if you ever encountered this, but one of the biggest lessons I learned as a producer on Disney games, EA games, but especially Disney Friends, was the difference between expressing things as a problem or as a solution. Because more than once, our partners, very well-meaning, would come to us and ask, well, we would like X, Y, and Z. And they had actually gone into a 6-hour meeting to discuss and come up with these solutions. But they didn't have all of our context. And so it was hard to figure out, were those the right solutions to the root problem? Often what they were coming to us with was super expensive or super complicated or almost impossible on the DS. And we ended up looking at them like they were aliens. Like, you want a what now? And so I had to learn very quickly, like, don't react emotionally when these wild requests would come in and be like, thank you so much. Could you give me a little bit more context as to what motivated this request? And when you react like that, you get a conversation. Oh, okay. Would you like that for maybe half as much money and less time? Because we could do it a different way and get the same result. I remember there was one request. They were trying to make changes to one of the adventure levels when what they really wanted was like more gameplay. And we could keep changing the adventure level all day, but there were limitations to the DS, the file size, the textures. It wasn't going to solve the problem they were trying to solve, but we could do something else for them. And these other ideas in the back burner. Have you encountered that?
Absolutely. So Jesse Schell taught me something all the way back in my Carnegie Mellon days.
Podcast level paused. Begin host commentary.
Jesse Schell taught both Amy and I game design during our time at the Entertainment Technology Center at Carnegie Mellon University. Jesse is a distinguished professor over at the Entertainment Technology Center, CEO of SYBO Games, and was kind enough to do the foreword for my book, The Game Development Strategy Guide.
Begin tutorial module. Creative collaboration technique.
He taught me the following phrase, which I think is a magical phrase. The phrase is, "That's interesting. Tell me more about that." And that's what you say when you're like, your emotions are like firing off like crazy and you're like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. What the heck are they asking for? Instead of saying all of that, you just say, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. Because you can often get to the root of the problem if you do that. You can often like dig down and find out what somebody really wants versus what they're actually asking for, which are usually not the same things. And I also learned, later on after Disney Friends, when I went to work directly for Disney on the publishing side, I learned, to try and not do that. Try to not come in with solutions that aren't framed without context. So instead of saying like, I've played your latest build and it sucks and here's what you need to do to fix it, it's much more effective if you come in and say, okay, so I'm playing the build and I'm seeing the following things. I'm seeing this, I'm seeing that. What are your thoughts around this? Like, what is your plan for fixing this issue? I'm happy to give you some of the solutions that I thought of, but I'd love to hear more about what it is that you guys are planning to do. And I find that if you start there, you're going to get a lot more information in the first place, but also it keeps it collaborative, right? I'm going to get what I need, you're going to get what you need, and we're going to really have a mutual understanding out of that conversation of what we need to do. I think that oftentimes when people come in and they just have the solution and they just have the fix, it's because they're stressed, they don't have a lot of time, they've got a million things going on. And I think it's easy to jump to those, I just need this right now. But I think setting context, understanding the why of the request is absolutely vital to getting what you really want in the long run.
After listening to that very, very balanced perspective, I think that a lot of listeners are hoping that you will be their next client. I think that one of the other motivations I've seen is people just sometimes think it's genuinely more helpful to provide solutions. Feels sometimes like a kindergartner bringing a macaroni picture and a parent having to say like, oh, thank you for that. What is that? It doesn't end up landing the way you intended to go, but we can help walk people through the journey and get to some kind of shared understanding, a phrase I really love.
Quite frankly, it's something I've had to learn as a designer as well, where, there'll be an issue and everybody will be talking on the team will be talking about what the issue is. And sometimes I just want to jump to the end, just make it blue. But if I do that, then the team's not coming along on the journey with me, right? They're not understanding why a seemingly arbitrary decision isn't arbitrary, why it's actually probably the best choice. And so I've had to learn to sort of like stop myself and then like carry people along on my thought process step by step, like slow my brain down and walk people through it. And I think that's made me a better designer. It's made me have a deeper understanding of how people think and how people get to conclusions than I had before.
Loading level 7. Global culture and communication in game design.
Can you share an example of a specific time when that kind of process worked out well for you?
I really came to terms with that while I was living in Denmark. Because, living and working in a culture that's not my own, that I didn't grow up in, that is a very different culture from the culture that I come from, it got me to sort of rethink a lot of my primary assumptions about things. I'll give you a concrete example. So we're working on a mobile game for kids, and we really wanted to have talking furniture in it. And so I said, just make it like Cherry from Pee-wee's Playhouse, right? Thinking like we all know who Cherry is, right? They had never heard of Pee Wee Herman. They had no idea who he was or what I was talking about. And I found myself having to like stop and be like, okay, it's a talking chair. When I say talking chair, here's what I mean. And let me draw you a little picture. And, it really made me a better designer in that I couldn't just rely on shorthand. I couldn't rely on this cultural basin that we could pull from, and had to really stop and describe exactly what I wanted in a way that really anyone could understand, which was a challenge, but I also think it was a really good experience ultimately. I also had to become very aware of cultural norms that we take for granted in this country that they really don't have the same understanding of. So on a difficult note, I think a lot of it was, if you're making a game for an American audience, you need to have an understanding of what issues are hot buttons or carry baggage for an American audience. There are certain words we don't use in this country for very good reasons, very big, very real historical reasons. And the Danes don't really have that perspective. So I found myself having very hard conversations sometimes with very well-intentioned people who just had no idea what they were doing. Another time, an incredibly talented Swedish artist that I work with, I came in one day and I was walking through our office, and I saw him putting a Native American war bonnet on a character that was like from the 1970s and was a disco character. And I was like, you can't really do that. And then that led to like a whole conversation about like, what do you mean I can't do that? I just did that. And it's like, okay, we need to stop. And I need to explain something to you about how the West was won and our cultural history there and why you need to be sensitive about this. And this isn't a costume. This is a religious artifact for a culture, that has been horribly mistreated. And so we need to approach this very carefully and culturally sensitively, which is not something that they have the same awareness of in Sweden that we do here. So there are a lot of these situations where working with an American team, I probably wouldn't have had to have that conversation, but I had to sort of stop, unpack it, and think about where people were coming from. Again, it comes back to the same root. Where are people coming from when they do something? And really digging into the psychology of that and understanding it.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. Situations you do not expect, like the things you learned in elementary school, middle school, and high school, suddenly you're the representative of American history for a group of people all over the world. I had that problem with localization testing I ran at EA, and they're like, why do you get to recall your governor in California? Why is Arnold Schwarzenegger your governor now? Like that. Well, we don't have time to unpack all of that. It worked out fine. But the story you describe also, I think, is a really important example of sometimes people treat cultural sensitivity as if it is some sort of optional thing or something that is overly sensitive. But you also bring up, if you're making a business decision to ship in the United States, you want a broader audience, it makes sense to be as tolerant as possible of as many perspectives as possible and not to just needlessly go in and offend people. And watching that thought process and you work with folks and be like, well, there's a reason we might not want to do this if we're going into this market. It's just a good reminder. I just wish people would do things for the right reasons all the time. But sometimes there's also that reminder of it's also a good business decision to be aware and sensitive and inclusive so that there's a safe environment for everybody to come and play.
I think for me as a designer, I just don't want to hurt people. Like if I can avoid causing people pain, I want to do the thing that's going to avoid causing somebody pain. And I think there's a lot of questioning of people's feelings that go on. Like, well, do they have the right to be offended? I don't care. If they're offended, they're offended. And if I can do something to help them, I'm going to do it. But that's just my perspective. For me, that supersedes the business reason, although I think the business reason is there too. So yeah, it's something, I try to carry forward. And I really just try to think about who our audience is and, how I can make the experience as pleasant as possible. Sometimes I feel like the job of game designer is closer to being a really good party planner than it is to like being other types of designers. I want people to like come to the party, aka play the game. I want them to feel really comfortable while they do it. I want them to like know what the rules are, like where they can put their coat. Should they take a drink? Where should they put their drinks down? I want them to feel like they can relax and just enjoy the experience and they don't have to worry about everything else. and I want it to be social, and I want the music to be at the right level. And, I want to keep the party going. Part of that is making sure that people aren't immediately yanked out of your experience for whatever, avoidable reason, it may be. And part of that is cultural insensitive. And part of that is just good UI, or good rules of design, or, making sure that we have a great tutorial that onboards people the right way. But just really understanding the emotions and the feeling that we're going for with the game or the experience itself.
Podcast level paused. Begin host commentary.
Amy's point about not yanking players out of the gameplay ties back to the motivators of play we talk about in the first chapter of the Game Development Strategy Guide. When we talk about what motivates people to play, if they're playing for comfort or, immersion, the second you rip that away because global chat is full of disruptive players or there's just a needlessly high friction UI decision, players have tens of thousands of other choices and you've just missed the mark on giving them the thing that they came to you for. So if you are looking to create an immersive experience, intentionality about the impact of your design choices is incredibly important, just like the intentionality Amy describes.
Loading. Podcast level 8. Emotional resonance as a game design tool.
But that was always something I saw working with you. You always had the player at the center, and that was how we were always able to make quality experiences. And I think that anyone who's making games for kids and manages to stay in it, I would like to think has that really strong core, because there's a lot of things you can do wrong in a kid's game that adults could kind of cope with, but you can send wrong messages, you can create unintentionally disruptive experiences for kids. There's almost this purity is the wrong word, but extra need for intentionality.
I mean, it's so funny because I think kids are more tolerant of technology, but I also think as a designer of kids, you have to be more aware of how kids might internalize, the experience or the message that you're giving, and really think long and hard about that. I also think that there's a certain joy, on the other hand, of understanding the rules of how to make people comfortable and then purposefully breaking them if you're making something scary or something where you want to keep people on the edge of their seats. I think it's really coming from the same place. It's just using your tool in one direction or the other direction. And it's something that, later on in my career, I've really enjoyed kind of scaring people a little bit here and there and messing with them in small ways.
I will say, I don't know if anyone can emulate these games anymore, but the 7th Guest and 11th Hour, those old school PC games were the first ones that really got me from a fear perspective. 11th Hour, it got me so bad that I never finished the game. And I'm sure people will play it now and be like, oh, that's your problem. But it created sounds and environment so much that I thought my computer was haunted. I was just like, I'm done with this. I cannot.
For me, the game that did that to me was Fatal Frame, because there was something about bringing your camera up and looking through your camera and then seeing ghosts that really, really scared me. And that was the one game that I had to put down, and I was like, I cannot play this game anymore. It is literally too scary. So Fatal Frame designers, if you're out there, good job.
Well done.
Loading. Podcast level 9. Strategy for video game leadership.
You've ascended the ranks and you move towards, you've mentioned the C-suite in some of your work. Strategy starts to become something you engage in working across titles or trying to figure out the long-term life of a particular game. Can you talk about your relationship with strategy as your career has grown?
As my career grew, at first it was strategy as being like the producer or the game director of a team, or you think about what do you need to do strategically to keep that game on track, to make sure you deliver at the quality you need to deliver, that everybody is happy, that you contingency plan for things that go wrong. But later on in my career, it became multiple games. And then in my last role, it was the studio itself. So thinking about what we need to do to keep the lights on in the studio. Okay, here's the landscape of the economics of games at this moment in time. What are we going to do to address that? And we had a lot of challenges thrown at us in the last game. Originally the game started out as a Web3 crypto game, and then the publisher ran into some issues there, and we pivoted to a traditional game, and making sure that we planned for all of that along the way so that we could keep the project moving and things going was really important. Making sure that our monetization strategies and sales strategies were in line with where the market was.
I mean, just that on its own is so much to deal with. Lots of people have trouble getting their head around blockchain and Web3, and to not only have to get your head around that, but then to reboot a whole game from that model to a traditional model, that's a tremendous pivot. And that really resets a game's whole take on monetization.
Something you and I have talked about is live service games and what it takes to really support a live service game and making sure you have, the right staff and the right runway to be able to do that in a way that makes sense. And, adapting to the market constantly changing, especially over the past several years, we've seen that happen an awful lot.
It is so hard to find the right balance of stability and agility when running a live service game and moving quarter to quarter and trying to keep your numbers up.
So, those have been the challenges that I've been focused more on lately. But that said, I think at heart, I love game design. That's the thing that I think about when I'm outside gardening or like taking a shower. Like it's always coming back to design and the player experience and what we can really make and deliver to the world as designers. That is what I'm very passionate about. So what's funny is in the role that I'm about to take, I'm taking much more of a design perspective than I have in other roles. It's still strategic. It's still focused on sort of breadth rather than one specific title, but it's back to my design roots in ways that I really have been missing and really love.
Loading podcast level 10. Interpreting intellectual property for games.
So excited for you, and I can't wait to see what happens on that journey. By the time listeners hear this, you will be well into that journey and they can look up some of that. One of the last questions I have is, you've worked on so many games, and sometimes you get to work on brand new IP and sometimes you're adapting existing IP. And I think the art of adapting IP sometimes gets a bad rap. But I wonder what your take is on your relationship with intellectual property and how you approach it, whether it's new or something that already exists.
I've worked on a lot of IP for companies like Disney, like Pixar. For me, I've really enjoyed the challenge of working with somebody else's IP. And I don't see it as a negative. Like for me, there's almost like a sacred responsibility when you can take this world or these characters that somebody else created and then carry them forward into a new experience for people who really love that IP. And I think the key there is understanding why people love that particular IP and how they want to interact with it. So I'll give you an example. So, if I'm going to make a Spider-Man game, I know that the player probably wants to be Spider-Man. Like nobody wants to be like Peter Parker's best pal who gets to watch Spider-Man web around the city. Like that's not a thing you want. You want to be Spider-Man. So that's where I'm going to start when I sit down to design a Spider-Man game.
Meanwhile, when I was working on the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe for the Game Boy Advance, it was very much about making sure all of the different Pevensey kids were represented as playable characters because everybody wants to see their favorite and live out that experience. And I also want to make sure there were not just combat mechanics, but game mechanics that captured the cold that was taking over Narnia. But I agree with you. I think that was part of the fun, was that solving for the problem of what was unique about those stories.
Really understanding what makes each IP special and why people love it so much, and really kind of taking that as a very deep responsibility to, make something that does justice to that. Not just for the creators, but for the fans as well. It's really important. And I don't care if I'm making it for 7-year-old girls or, 35-year-old guys. I want to really do right by that. And I try to bring that sensibility into new IP. If we're making new IP, how can we really flesh out this world to make it feel deep and to feel like there are multiple perspectives that you can have on the things that are going on? And, what are people curious about? What mysteries can we put in the world that people are going to want to discover or solve, or get intrigued by or think about later on? And, understanding that relationship between, fan and IP, I think is a really powerful one, and one that I've, been blessed to work on a lot of just amazing properties. But also, it's really allowed me to become better when I create something new.
I love that perspective too, that the more you work with existing intellectual property, the more it strengthens you when you do make that step to work with original work and build new intellectual property, which is just a fancy industry term for creative content of some kind.
I think one of the highest compliments we ever got with working on IP was when you went and you recorded Stitch VO with Chris Sanders, the guy who had created Stitch, and how excited he was by what we were doing and how he felt so, I think, good about what we'd created that he drew. Do you still have the little drawing?
Oh, I do. It's in the other room. It's this adorable little sketch of Stitch standing at a recording booth microphone with a recording stand. And I'll put a little image of it in the show notes. But Chris gave that to the team to celebrate what we were doing. And he was a dream to work with. It's so amazing. And we don't have time to unpack that, which was one of the best business trips ever. But you're right. That was an honor to see the person who had created such impactful intellectual property excited about the interpretation of it in a new medium. And I will always regret that they didn't let us keep those outtakes.
Exactly. And later on, when I went, and worked for Disney directly and was writing some scripts for Pixar characters in particular, I really tried to do justice by that. I wanted characters to say the things that they would say if they were those characters. So I tried to pull lines out of films to make sure that they would be worded exactly the way that like Mater would say something or the way that Nemo would say something, and really stay true to that. And so, to me, the highest mark of honor was when I would get a script back and it would have very few notes from the Pixar team about what I needed to change, because that meant that I got the voice right. But really understanding an IP and why people love it it speaks to our experience as being human, what it means to be human and what it means to love something. And, to me, that's just, we're very lucky to get to work on stuff that people love.
I love the selflessness in the way you describe your work on the Pixar stuff. It's not about you making a dent on that character. It's you helping that character shine as truthfully as possible. And the accomplishment is in doing that, not in one-linering that character out into infinity. I love that, and that's a great thing to aspire to.
Loading. Final boss level. Future of video gaming technology.
In our remaining time, are there any other questions you wish I had asked?
One of the questions that you had sent over to me was about the future and where I think technology is going.
Yes, let's talk about the future of technology and gaming.
Yeah, I found myself thinking about that question so much. Because, to be frank, I think the future is in, XR. I think, whether it's VR or AR, I think that, that is a very exciting future to me, which is why that's my future path. And I don't know if it'll happen today or tomorrow, but it will happen. And I think that's really exciting. But I also want to take a minute to talk about what I think the future isn't, because I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I think there's a lot of discussions going on right now about artificial intelligence. And I personally believe that AI can be a great tool. It can do a lot of things that, humans can do, but it can do it a lot faster. And that can be a superpower for us in many ways when done ethically and responsibly. However, I don't think can it replace human creativity? Yeah, I guess we could fire all writers and designers and artists and painters in the world and just have computers do it. But I'm not worried about that. And I'll tell you why. It's taken me a long time to not be worried about that. I come back to pottery. So pottery is something that I've been learning over the past couple months. I joined a pottery studio. I spent a lot of time throwing bad lopsided pots in pursuit of learning to get better at doing it. And I had this realization that you can go into IKEA, right? Or go into Crate and Barrel, and you can buy a perfect mug, right? This mug is perfectly balanced. It's perfectly proportioned. It's ergonomically designed for your hand, and it's going to cost you $10, right? It's a great mug. But people are still buying pottery. They're still making and they're still buying pottery. And the reason for that is that handmade item has a soul that the machine-made item just doesn't. And I feel the same way about AI. I can ask AI to write me a script, and you know what? It'll probably do a fairly decent job at writing me a script. But it's missing that factor, that essence of being that you get when you have a handmade object. So listen, could we fire all the potters and just have, machine-made pottery? Absolutely, we could. But there's a reason why people are signing up for pottery classes in droves. I think we as humans are hungry for that human-made imperfection of experience. And I also think that if I were ever to give a TED Talk, it would be about how people's imperfections are the things that we love. That it's not perfection that our eye likes, it's the imperfection, right? The things that make you memorable are the things that aren't perfect about you. And I think the same is true of art and creation in general. Yes, you can have a computer design you a game, but it's going to feel stale. And I remember the heyday designers, Supercell, giving a speech years ago at the GDC about how they designed the economy for heyday. And about how it wasn't just putting the numbers in a spreadsheet so the economy numbers line up. It was about then breaking the math, making it a little fuzzy so that it felt real and felt human. And so that's my rant, my anti-AI rant in the future.
I think there's so much to that. And when you talk about the imperfections, that resonates a lot with me as a professional improviser who spent many years performing, because the ultimate backhanded compliment from audiences was when people came up afterwards and were like,
There's no way that was improvised. That was a script, right?
and it was almost disappointment to audiences when they thought it was too good. They didn't want a script. They came because they wanted something unique and novel that was different because they were there, giving those suggestions, that immediacy. And those audiences were joyful because they could tell that raw element meant that we were just on the edge. And there was no doubt in their mind that what they got was both spontaneous and satisfying, raw and magical. And that's the thing about AI. It's trained on prior data, and it's not going to surprise you most of the time. And the more you run it, the less it's probably going to surprise you. All these models are going to sort of peter out into oblivion if you stop all artists creating today. What are you going to train the AI on? They're just going to keep creating the same thing forever. Having humans create, we still get that rawness. Maybe it's wobbly pottery, but you've never seen it before.
Exactly. And I think that AI art was most interesting when it was really screwing up. Like when you would get something with 6 hands or the wrong number of fingers. That was really interesting to me. It was like, oh, why is it doing that? And what's going on there? Like as an artist, like my brain would zoom in on that in a kind of interesting way. But now they're fixing it. And I think it's ruining AI art.
We want the double rainbows. If you're going to do the AI anyway, make it weird.
Exactly. That was useful, right? Because it would get you to think about something differently. I never envisioned this character with 6 hands. Now I know what it looks like.
It's such a good point. And you're not alone. The AI topic is very top of mind for many of the folks I speak with. And the other thing, too, is creator culture, like watching people on TikTok and Twitch and everything like that. The relationship with the people who create the video game art. You can't have a relationship with the AI creators, at least not yet. I mean, okay, technically you can have a relationship with ChatGPT, but it's not a very healthy one yet. But I think that's going to be part of it, too. How do game developers start showing up, showing the work for the fans who are hungry to lean into that authenticity?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think, making things and putting them out in the world, I think is just so important, whether it's a game or a piece of pottery or a painting or, whatever it is. And it's also, I think, an act of bravery. Every time we make a game, we don't know if it's going to be successful. We don't know if people are going to love it, if they're going to hate it. And I think developing a certain degree of resilience around that is important if you want to stay in this industry for the long haul.
Loading. Final podcast level. Links and follow-up.
Amy, thank you so much for your time. It has been a joy to reconnect with you and walk down memory lane. Is there anything you want to share about how people can find you on socials and keep following your work?
Google me, you'll find me. Please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer questions and talk more about why I think AI is not going to take over the world.
We all look forward to seeing how you redefine extended reality in the years to come. Congratulations, and thank you so much again. It's always an honor.
Absolutely my pleasure, Cheryl.
If you enjoyed Amy's perspective, don't forget to check out how her insights were featured in context in the Game Development Strategy Guide, my new book from Rosenfeld Media. It's now available for pre-order from rosenfeldmedia.com or your favorite online bookseller. Pre-orders received on rosenfeldmedia.com before our release on September 16th, 2025 will receive 15% off. I'm your host, Cheryl Platts, reminding you to join me next time for another conversation with one of the experts from my book as we explore what it takes to create video games that don't just survive, but thrive.
Initiating final credits sequence. Podcast. Enduring Play. Created and produced by Cheryl Platts. Copyright Idea Platts, LLC. All rights reserved. Podcast theme composed by Cheryl Platts. To learn more about Cheryl's books, visit rosenfeldmedia.com. For book and podcast merch, go to ideaplatts.dashery.com. Some transition music licensed by Adobe Stock. Follow Cheryl on Blue Sky at Funny Godmother. To To learn more about IdeaPlats, the design education consultancy, visit ideaplats.com.